The Russia-Ukraine war, which began in February 2022, has now stretched into its fourth year. What started as a military invasion has evolved into one of the longest and most consequential conflicts of the 21st century. By 2025, the war is no longer just about Ukraine's sovereignty. It has become a global issue shaping economics, diplomacy, energy, and the balance of power worldwide. In this video, we'll break down white heavy checkmark the current situation in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. White heavy checkmark how the war has changed Europe's security and NATO's future. White heavy checkmark the economic impact on global trade, food, and energy. White heavy checkmark the role of the United States, China, and BRICS in shaping outcomes. White heavy checkmark what this war means for ordinary people and the future of global politics. Stay with us, because the war in Ukraine is more than just regional. It is redefining world order. As of early 2025, the front lines remain highly contested. Ukraine has maintained strong resistance, supported by Western allies with military aid, financial support, and advanced weapon systems. Russia, on the other hand, has adapted its strategy, focusing on attrition, cyber warfare, and leveraging its alliances with nations like Iran, North Korea, and China for supplies and diplomatic cover. Key updates from 2025. Ukraine has regained some territories in the south but faces difficulties in the east. Russia continues heavy drone and missile strikes, targeting infrastructure. Both nations are suffering economic exhaustion, with millions displaced and cities damaged. The battlefield remains stalemated, but politically, the war has already transformed Europe and the world. One of the clearest consequences of the war is the revival of NATO. Finland and Sweden, once neutral, have officially joined NATO, strengthening its northern flank. Eastern European nations like Poland and the Baltic states have significantly increased military spending. NATO now sees Russia as its primary long-term threat, reorganizing its defense strategy. For Europe, the war has ended decades of relative peace and forced governments to rethink everything from energy dependence to military readiness. The continent is now more united against Moscow, but also more dependent on Washington for security. For the US, the Russia-Ukraine war has been both a challenge and an opportunity. Washington has led the effort to arm and fund Ukraine, strengthening its global leadership role. The war has also allowed the US to tighten transatlantic ties, keeping Europe aligned. However, internally, US politics are divided. Some Americans question the massive financial cost of supporting Ukraine. Still, in global terms, the US has used the conflict to reaffirm its position as the world's security leader, countering Russia and keeping China in check indirectly. China has walked a careful diplomatic line. Officially, Beijing calls for peace and negotiations. In practice, China has deepened trade with Russia, buying discounted oil and gas, and providing dual-use technology. China benefits economically from a weakened Russia but avoids open confrontation with the West. For Beijing, the war is a test case. If Russia can withstand Western sanctions, it shows that alternative economic systems, like BRICS, yuan-based trade, and non-dollar alliances, can succeed. Thus, China sees the war less as a European crisis and more as a global shift of power away from the West. Another major development is the role of the Global South. Countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America have resisted taking sides. Many nations, struggling with inflation and food shortages, blame the war for rising costs, but do not fully support Western sanctions. BRICS, now expanded in 2025 to include Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, and others, offers Russia a diplomatic shield. This highlights a multipolar world. While the West is united against Moscow, much of the Global South prefers neutrality, prioritizing economic survival over geopolitics. Energy has been one of the biggest weapons of this war. Europe has largely cut itself off from Russian oil and gas, turning instead to the US, Norway, and Middle Eastern suppliers. Russia redirected its energy exports to China, India, and other Asian markets. The global oil and gas trade has shifted eastward, accelerating new energy alliances. This reshaping of energy flows is one of the clearest examples of how the Russia-Ukraine war has permanently rewired the global economy. Beyond energy, The war has disrupted global food supplies. Ukraine, once called the breadbasket of Europe, has seen its grain exports blocked or reduced by conflict in the Black Sea. Many African and Middle Eastern countries dependent on Ukrainian grain faced crises in 2023 to 24, and by 2025 supply chains are still fragile. Inflation, shipping delays, and food shortages continue to hit vulnerable nations hardest. For everyday people worldwide, the war is felt not through missiles but through higher grocery bills, fuel prices, and inflation. There have been multiple peace talks since 2022, but none have led to lasting agreements. In 2025, Brazil, India, and Turkey have offered to mediate. Western leaders insist on full Ukrainian sovereignty, while Moscow demands recognition of annexed territories. The deadlock remains, with both sides unwilling to concede. The lack of peace progress has frustrated neutral nations, who argue the war only benefits arms manufacturers and geopolitical rivalry, not ordinary people. The war has created one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. Over 10 million Ukrainians have fled to Europe since 2022. By 2025, many have integrated into countries like Poland, Germany, and the UK, reshaping local demographics. Russia itself has seen emigration of professionals, students, and tech workers leaving due to sanctions and restrictions. Migration trends show that wars are not confined to battlefields. They ripple into labor markets, schools, and societies around the world. Another major battlefield is digital. Russia has used cyber attacks to target Ukraine's infrastructure and Western systems. Ukraine, with NATO support, has developed some of the most advanced cyber defense strategies in the world. Tech companies like SpaceX, Microsoft, and others have played roles in supporting Ukraine's digital resilience. This marks a new era. Wars are no longer fought only with tanks and missiles, but with data, networks, and satellites. It's easy to talk about geopolitics, but the real tragedy is human. Thousands of civilians have died. Millions live in fear under constant shelling. Families are separated, children grow up as refugees, and entire communities are erased. For ordinary Ukrainians and Russians alike, this war has left deep scars that will last generations. The Russia-Ukraine war has become more than a conflict. It is a turning point in world order. Multipolarity: the war accelerates the shift from US-dominated unipolarity to a multipolar world. Alliances: NATO is stronger, BRICS is growing, and the global south is more assertive. Economics: the dollar remains dominant, but alternative systems are gaining traction. Security: nations are rearming, signaling a return to Cold War-like dynamics. In short, the war is reshaping how power, resources, and influence are distributed globally. Where does this lead? 3 possible futures stand out. Frozen conflict: the war drags on with shifting frontlines but no peace deal, similar to Korea after 1953. Negotiated settlement: international pressure eventually forces a compromise, though unlikely to satisfy both sides fully. Escalation: a dangerous possibility where fighting spreads beyond Ukraine, pulling in NATO directly. Each path carries huge consequences for global politics, trade, and security. The Russia-Ukraine war in 2025 is no longer just about 2 countries. It is a mirror reflecting the state of global politics. It shows us how fragile peace can be, how interconnected economies are, and how quickly alliances can shift. But the real question remains: white right-pointing backhand index, will this war mark the end of Western dominance and the rise of a multipolar world? White right-pointing backhand index, or will it only deepen divisions, pushing humanity further apart instead of closer together? Only time will tell. But one thing is clear: the war in Ukraine has already changed global politics, and the world will never be the same again.